all, welcome to Leaders of Tomorrow, India's largest platform for entrepreneurs. Anything and everything that matters to you, the entrepreneur, we cover it here on the show. I'm Sunanda Jaiseelan. We bring you the biggest expert voices, not just from India, but across the globe to guide and mentor and handhold you, the small business owners. Speaking of worldwide leaders, we're bringing you a very special conversation tonight. Mihir Bhatt is in conversation with Peter Zeihan, Geopolitical Strategist Founder Zeihan on Geopolitics.
Welcome to this exclusive interview that I'm doing with one of the most noted geopolitical analysts and author I have with us, Mr. Peter Zeihan, joining us straight across from US. Peter, thank you so much. It's a pleasure having you on Times Network as always.
It's great to be back.
Absolutely. Peter, I'm actually going to, jog back your memory a bit because as you remember, and all of us do, you were one of the star speakers at India Economic Conclave this year. And in fact, the whole theme of your session was very interesting. It was India's golden decade, because as you know, we have entered a new decade. And then we had a bit of a wobbly start because India ran into major second wave, which, by the way, you had very rightly predicted, because at that point, India was still sort of in a confused state of mind that are we into a second wave? Is there going to be a second wave, etc., etc.? And we ran into, in fact, the worst possible second wave across the globe. Now, as we come out of it, the numbers in terms of cases have dwindled. And in fact, it's almost at 1/10 of what it was at its peak. Are we out of woods?
The short version is absolutely not. Coronavirus has shown that it's among the more mutable of the coronavirus strains that are out there. So it's more capable of doing some sort of minor modifications to its genome in order to adapt to circumstances. And we're actually, not just for India, but for the world writ large, entering the danger zone right now, because we have portions of the world, like the United States, that are now majority vaccinated. And we have strains like, say, the beta strain out of South Africa or the gamma strain out of Brazil that either allow for partial bypassing of naturally gained immunity or allow for reinfection under multiple steps. So you can get the gamma strain out of Brazil 3-4 times. In that sort of environment, the virus is now being presented with a mixed sort of legacy. It's got half the population that is just flat out vulnerable, and it's got half the population that has a degree of resistance, and that is what is going to mutate in. So I would expect the next globally significant strain to come out of the developed world, where we already have a degree of this immunization complete. I'm most concerned about places where the Sinovac vaccine is in place. Because it's proven to not be very effective against any of the variants, but very effective against the original variant. And that sort of mixed environment is kind of the perfect situation for generating another generation of this bug that can once again go global, which means that if you're in India and you've caught coronavirus, even if you've caught the Delta variant, you're very likely to be able to get it again until you can get vaccinated. Now, the bright spot there is India is the world power when it comes to immunization manufacturing capacity. But starting next year, once India starts cranking these out, first millions a month and then tens of millions a month, we are looking at a significantly different picture for India specifically as compared to the rest of the developing world. And I can very easily imagine a scenario that we get to the third quarter of next year, and the rich world is immunized, and India is mostly immunized. But then everyone who is dependent upon the Chinese vaccine is dealing with things that just rip through it like tissue paper. That's likely where we're going to be a year from now.
Mm-hmm. But which means India needs to be fully prepared for a third wave, because currently, there are two camps, and one camp believes that there is going to be a third wave and we need to be fully prepared for it. The other camp believes that, yes, there will be a third wave. It's going to be relatively softer compared to second wave. Now, what's your take on that?
It's like, it's really difficult to know we know there's going to be a third wave. That's undeniable. The vaccine is sufficiently mutable, we will have it. The question is whether or not it's going to put more people in hospital. And there is no way to know that ahead of time. The vaccine will do what makes sense for the vaccine. And in a partially immunized environment that we have in portions of the world, that means it will focus on transmissibility, and it'll focus on breaking through pre-existing immunity, specifically the sort that is granted from having coronavirus the first time, which means that if you had it the first time, you can count on getting it again. You're still vulnerable. But we can't necessarily that it's going to kill more people. We should plan for it, though.
Right. Now, Peter, in that context, and I think this is a very important point that you are making, that we are actually now entering a danger zone. The developed world, the West, seems to be a little overconfident. We saw what happened at Eurocup and the amount of crowd that was allowed in stadiums, and the way US has also mentioned officially on record that, people who are fully vaccinated can go without mask in open spaces and all. Now, when we put all of that together and look at it from economic prism, are we looking at a false sort of optimism or recovery that's currently, I would say, happening across the globe, including India?
Well, I really hesitate to condemn public policymakers because they're making policy with a series of guesses based on guesses. There's a reason why I'm not in government. It's like I don't have the mental fortitude to make decisions like that. There are two ways that epidemics end. Number one, everyone becomes immune some way or the other. If that's the path we choose for COVID, we are in this for at least another 5 years. That's how long it's going to take the world to be able to make enough vaccine every year to get everybody shot up and boosted. That's just what it's going to be.
Which means that probably this whole optimism about economy coming back on track, US leading the revival, China already up and running, and India not getting impacted to the extent that it was feared in the second wave, it might actually go out of the window, and we might be looking at another major full-blown economic crisis.
In the United States, in Mexico, in Canada, we're going to have mass vaccination completed very shortly, or at least sufficiently in the centers of economic activity. So, in the United States, we've got this weird duality right now where California and New York and Chicago and Miami are pretty much all vaccinated, but there's a lot of places in more rural regions that are not. This is going to sound harsh, but from an economic point of view, that's fine. Because if Missouri chooses to have a mass epidemic in half their population, that really doesn't move the needle for the United States very much in terms of GDP. And so that's our normal now. We can live with the degree of infection that we have, and it's not impacting America's bottom line for the most part. We can adapt around it. So North America is already firing on all cylinders, and the United States specifically is likely to have 10% annualized growth in the last half of this year, which is the fastest in our history, right? For developing or for a developed country, that's unheard of. But just wow, and there's inflation of that, but it's something we can live with. For India, it's more of a mixed picture. India, how do I phrase this? Your tolerance for public health crises is a lot higher than it is in the United States.
Yeah,
and because your population is so much closer together, what you would need to do in terms of lockdown to actually stop something like Delta is just extreme. And I'm not sure democracy can handle it. I'm not sure China can handle it. I mean, this is the most communicable public health threat that we have dealt with as a species since measles.
True.
This is not something where you just go inside for 2 weeks and you're done. This is like a multi-month lockdown, and Australia is kind of the outlier for showing us just how extreme it has to be if you actually want to make progress. So in India, if you know the vaccines are coming, there is definitely a temptation just to declare it over for the time being, suck up a third wave and move on. That is a decision that can only be made at the top.
We have to take a quick commercial break on that note. Back in just a moment. Welcome back. You with us here on Leaders of Tomorrow Icons. Our icon today is world-renowned geopolitical strategist and founder Zeihan on Geopolitics, Peter Zeihan.
Peter, my concern is here we were talking about the golden decade for India, maybe, 3 months before from now. And now we are in a situation where you have China, and I'm sure you would have gone through the statement that the Chinese president made on the 100th anniversary of the CCP. And then there are people who believe that Joe Biden is actually more Trump-like than Trump himself when it comes to dealing with China.
Absolutely, I'm one of them.
Exactly. So, when you look at the current situation from that lens or from that prism, should we be more prepared, especially India, because of the border that it shares with China, for a much more hot border, I would say, with China and with Pakistan on one hand, and at the same time deal with this developing situation between US and China, if we want to call it a trade war? I mean, it's much more than that, but still.
Well, the situation between the United States and China is going to get significantly worse. It's not going to get better ever. We're at the beginning of the end of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or whatever you want to call it. In the United States, there's now legal links at the US level, at the NATO level, at the EU level, between Chinese state authorities and Chinese cyber criminals, basically saying that they're working hand in glove. And there is no way that decisions like that are made and proclamations like that are made without policy follow-up. So you should count on all supply chains across the Pacific shattering over the course of the next few years, based on decisions that are made in Beijing or Washington. It could happen in the next few months. So, for example, if the Biden administration chooses to boycott the Chinese Olympics, that's it. It's over, because every American sponsor of the Olympics would then have to pull the plug, which means that the Chinese would have no choice in their mind but to confiscate every asset they have. So you're talking about things like United Airlines, Nike, big companies, and any American firm that is then still operating in China would be enthusiastically labeled by their competitors as active sponsors of the genocide games. I mean, this is the end of this relationship. For India, that's a glorious opportunity. India manufacturing has its flaws, but even if all India does is expand its manufacturing capacity to displace Chinese imports, that it would increase your base by like 40%. That assumes you don't go after any supply chain or any integration with any of China's former partners. I mean, the upside opportunity for India here is just impossible to overstate. And that assumes the security situation doesn't bubble up. If that happens, there can't be a conventional war anymore between India and China or India and Pakistan. The nuclear deterrent prevents that. But there's nothing to say that India can't start, being the power of the Indian Ocean, which would make it impossible for the Chinese to integrate with Europe, would make it impossible for the Chinese to get oil. I mean, if you want to talk about a death blow, that's how you would do it. There's some risk here, of course, but the upside on almost every economic sector is just glorious. So my biggest disagreement with what you said there is that it's not going to be an Indian golden decade. It's going to be like 3 or 4.
I hope that happens. Coming back to India and the Indian economy, if you were, and since you sound pretty optimistic about, India's future from economy or country point of view, and like you rightly said, that it's going to be 3 or 4 decades minimum and not one golden decade for India. Now, if that has to translate into some growth for Indian companies, Indian population, if you were running, let's say, a firm in India or a manufacturing facility in India, or you were an entrepreneur in India right now, what would be your strategy? What would be, your next step?
Well, those are 3 very different questions. Let's start with the easy one, manufacturing. because of India's infrastructure, manufacturing opportunities are limited, but there are a lot of new technologies that are coming up, things like additive manufacturing that don't require a big gangly supply chain. So if you start applying these things in India for your value-added product, I think that India can do very well with displacing a lot of the stuff out of the East Asian rim fairly quickly. We know you have the educational base. We know you have the skilled labor force. It's an infrastructure issue. And these new technologies allow you to get around some of that. So that's kind of piece one. Piece two, manufacturing supply chains that don't use that technology. The more problems that China has, the deeper their demographic crisis gets, and it's already awful. The less competitive the Chinese are going to be able to, the less competitive the Chinese are at low and mid-range manufacturing. They can't do the high at all. Now, India's biggest problem is machinery. You don't have the technical setup in order to do that at scale. So you're gonna have to do what the Chinese did and import it. But once that is done, you do have the labor force, you do have the port capacity to participate in supply chains with at least Southeast Asia. Now, that's not going to generate a Chinese style boom because that is so artificial and so juiced up with artificially cheap credit. India has a much more stable financial system that wouldn't support that. But you can still expand your manufacturing base by a third probably in 5 years. That's the low lying fruit. So it's about getting a meaningful, friendly relationship and some brown or greenfield space and a port city. Really, that's all it takes. I wouldn't think of India as India, where you have multiple supply chain steps within the country, and I would instead think of India as a series of less advanced Singapores, where the ports are the ones who are the nodes and they integrate with Southeast Asia as much as they integrate with the rest of India. It's a model that has worked in a lot of the world. I think Britain is probably the best historical example. If you want to go way back, it's certainly what the Indonesians do now. And there's no reason that India can't push into that.
One last question to you, Peter. If you were leading India at this point in time, 3 things that you would do to ensure that India achieves its true potential or destiny. And obviously it's a long-term game. It doesn't happen overnight. And when I say overnight, I mean 10, 15 years. It's a long-term play.
Okay. First of all, I would prepare for the fall of China in terms of economic possibilities. There are a lot of pieces that Chinese are going to drop, and India is picking up some of them. And the fact that India is maybe picking up 10% of what China is losing without even trying, I think gives you an idea of the upside potential here. So that's a change to internal tariffs. You basically need to do what the Canadians finally got around to doing 2 years ago and have an internal free trade agreement. You have too many barriers within your own provinces. Second, Bangalore is going to take care of itself. High-skilled labor always does. You need to focus on getting people from basic education to the next step up in terms of technical skills. One of the things that we've missed here in the United States is we made the decision back in the 60s that everybody wants a white-collar job. Nobody wants a blue-collar job. And as a result, blue-collar jobs today pay more in their first month than a white-collar job will at 6 years. That sort of mismatch makes no sense. So anything you can do to expand technical skill at the base level, I think will really help you, not just in the long term, but especially in the short term in terms of going after some of this business and manufacturing capacity. And then third, you guys have got to bring agriculture into the 17th century. It's just that is arguably the single biggest security risk that you face moving forward. And India's demography is not as young as you might think. India is now one of the 20 fastest aging societies in the world. The preference for boys and the dense urban clusters that you have now have really slimmed down your demographic structure compared to 20 years ago. That's good and that's bad. On the good, you have a lot of 20-somethings that now have small or no families, which means that they're very value-added. They're moving up the value-added scale, their educational scale very quickly because they can afford to spend their money on themselves as opposed to their children. You're going to have a consumption boom. That means you should have a manufacturing boom and an education boom. These are all good things. But if you fast forward 15 years, that moment starts to pass. Now, you're not aging nearly as fast as Germany or Korea or China. I'm not talking about a demographic bomb here. But the changing structure does mean that you will have fewer young people in the future. So you need to take the most advantage of this aging demographic, age roughly 15 to 30 right now, and get them as skilled as you can so that as they age, they can just blow all your expectations out of the water.
All right. I think that's a very interesting observation on India, and I would say at least a blueprint for India's rise. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you again sometimes later this year, maybe in person, hopefully. Thank you so
That'd be
much,
great.
Peter.
Until next time.
Until next time. Thank you so much.
All right, completely out of time on this episode. If you have any feedback for us, we love hearing from you as always. Your comments, your feedback, your suggestions, your thoughts. Welcome. Contact details are coming up as we speak. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.